Hello, Mr. Dylan Freeman. Today we have a good and happy opportunity to ask Mr. Dylan to tell us about mentor and godfathers of Zimbabwean and South African falconers, because from one side Mr. Freeman is a good falconer himself, but also at the same time he's a nephew of another well-known falconer, Mr. Stafford. So being born and grown up among such a great team, we would like to ask you to tell your stories, your memoirs and recollections of these great people. So word to you, please.
Fantastic. I want to say thanks very much, Evgeny, for the opportunity to talk and create awareness about African falconry, which is often not known that well, although we have a very, very high standard of falconry. And yeah, thanks to the Falconry Heritage Trust for preserving these memories. The key to the future of falconry is our past. Just as we look back to all these books and documents and historical artifacts of falconry, we need to be doing it in our time. And right now we're in a golden age. We've got all this technology of GPSs, robotic aeroplanes that we can fly to train these birds to maximum fitness. We need to document this and keep it going. So yeah, thank you for the good work to Falconry Heritage Trust and all the supporters and sponsors of that. And then of course to falconers all around the world for following their dreams and their passions. So basically what you touched on earlier was what I'm very fond of, I feel very strongly as well, is mentorship. A key to growing a good falconer or a good individual in any activity, specifically falconry here, is mentorship. Why reinvent the wheel when somebody's already gone through the struggles? If you can have someone to teach you and to pass on that information, you can benefit from their years of experience, add on your experience. And very often you'll hear long time down the line, the mentor will say, oh, the student has become the teacher, because you've been able to build off what they've developed and then grow your own style. Now, as you mentioned, Evgeny, earlier, I was very privileged. I had an introduction to falconry that most don't. Most people have the story of an injured hawk that they look after and rehabilitate it, or they know someone with a falcon, or they saw someone with a falcon. I had a slightly different introduction. I grew up in Zimbabwe, wildlife all around. I remember camping as a kid. People laugh, but a true story. My first pet was a warthog. I didn't have a dog as a pet. I had a little pig, a wild pig, warthog. My dad was part of a wildlife society, so as a kid I was exposed to being outdoors. And that was great. But I also had another way of entering into falconry, in that my uncle was an established falconer in the Zimbabwe Falconers Club. With that, it set me up for success in becoming a professional falconer. What I do now, I get paid to fly falcons for people. It's wonderful. I've been all around the world. I've been exposed to many different styles of falconry, and that is all because of the good mentorship that I received in the beginning. So basically, my uncle is a falconer in Zimbabwe. His passion is flying casts of African peregrine teasels, either passage birds or taken from an eyrie, or captive bred birds. Now recently he's had more access to captive bred birds, and that way you train them up. And as a youngster, as a way to have fun after school, I got a little hawk, trained it, he would show me the ropes. My uncle was involved in some BBC documentaries, National Geographic documentaries, where he was training eagles for the close-up shots. So when you see a documentary and there's a really close-up shot of a falcon or an eagle's face, chances are it's a trained bird. Because he was a falconer and he had contacts, he was able to train these birds for TV production, and that basically funded his personal falconry, where he could go out and fly casts of teasels at game birds in the African bush. Now, Zimbabwe falconry is very often overlooked because we're not the US, we're not the UK, we don't have historical ties on face value as what European or Asian countries have. So falconry in Africa is often not looked at, but we have an abundance of falconry species that we can tap into. We've got an abundance of quarry, everything from tiny little mouse or shrew for your little gabar goshawk or lizard buzzard, all the way up to a rock hyrax that you can catch with a Varro's black eagle. Hunting monkeys with crowned eagles, or flying passage peregrines at sandgrass. We've got a wide array of quarry that we can pursue. And what supports that is good environmental management practices, which allow us to have the countryside, good farming areas, good protected regions where you can go out and practice falconry. So with falconry starting in Africa, it has quite a long history, mostly after the Great War, World War I, World War II. Guys would come back, they would be exposed to falconry or have ancestral exposure to falconry from the colonial lands. Basically, you would come in, you would see all of these falcons, and you would want to pursue falconry. There's a lot of well-known falconers that have come out. Many great artists of birds of prey have been exposed to Southern African falconry, and if we include Central Africa like Tanzania and Kenya and all of that. But the core of it is good management structure for our populations. Now, the way Zimbabwe falconry and South African falconry had a major impact and influence on worldwide falconry is how we use a mentorship program. We basically have a grading system. If you can liken it to the American master falconer, general falconer system, we have a C grade, B grade, A grade, and then a master grade. There's a lot that goes into it, and you have a mentor and you apprentice under that mentor for a number of years. As you become proficient with each aspect of falconry, you progress on to the next level. You have to have a certain amount of field craft. You have to know about land management. One of the main things that a great falconer, Ron Hartley, used to promote is quarry. Understand your quarry. You'll never know how to catch a sandgrass unless you know where to find it. Same thing with ducks. Same thing with when you're hunting, let's say, a red grouse in Scotland. You need to know where to find it and what area it wants. So you don't just become a falconer, you become an ornithologist, you become a naturalist, and it's amazing how many are also artists or scientists as well. We become encapsulated in our passion, which is falconry. So with the African structures, Southern African structures, South Africa Falconers Association, Zimbabwe Falconers Association, we have this grading system where it's not to restrict people from falconry, but it's to promote ethical falconry. That way, we know that we are setting our apprentices up for success. These apprentices aren't going to go through the headaches that someone who hasn't got guidance would normally have. Poor footing equipment, not knowing how to train the bird, not knowing the proper management styles. And you can learn that all from a book, but as we all know, falconry is very much a practical activity. So having a mentor there to guide you through the way not only preserves falconry and its ethical practices, but it also encourages falconry to be practiced by the people who would want to then conserve it. And a big part of African falconry is because we all have access to wildlife and we all have access to going and seeing these birds in nature. You want to become a spectator in it. How do you become a spectator in falconry? Well, in wild raptor populations is by participating in its conservation. And as we all know, some of the first conservationists, ornithologists must have been falconers. So yeah, pretty much what I do now is I'm a professional falconer. I have worked for a number of organizations. I've worked around the world, in South Africa, I've worked in Zimbabwe, I've worked in the Gulf, and more recently in the UK. My particular specialty, if you can call it a specialty niche, is I'm an RC pilot. We use drones or remote controlled prey like the roe crow, the roebara, and a lot of multitudes of other versions, flying wings, delta wings, berg wings, RC aeroplanes, drones. But my specialty is basically using those training aids to enhance fitness. Now, a lot of purists will say, well, why do you want to use a RC aeroplane for fitness? It's just to maximize my training window and set the bird up for success in its enthusiasm, in its mind, knowing that it's confident enough. Also learning flying skills. Now, a lot of things have led me to become a RC pilot. I was never going to fly RC aeroplanes for myself for fun. I always had an interest in watching them, but it's only when I saw the value to falconry. And that's kind of what I do now. I've worked on film sets, training birds, but even though I use all of these supportive measures to pay for my falconry, my essence is still hunting. Definition of falconry is hunting wild quarry with a trained bird of prey in a natural environment, and no amount of training or fun flying to the lure or RC will ever make up for the wild hunt. It's not always about the kill, although the kill is great. It's about the style of flight and the bond that you develop with the specific birds. My two personal favorites are hawk eagles. I love the African hawk eagle, so medium size, 1 to 1.4 kilo eagle, very good on feather or fur. I love them. You build a long-term bond with them. One of the gentlemen that I'm going to speak about briefly later is Ron Hartley, and he had an African hawk eagle by the name of Scylla, and she was legendary. Must have taken over 1,000 head of quarry, probably more. She died at over 35 years old. Great bird. So I love African hawk eagles. And then for me, of course, a passage peregrine. There's nothing like it for me for hunting sandgrass. High flying game birds where you've got it to lose. The sandgrass has all the cards and you've got to work hard to get them. Those are my two favorites. But I wouldn't be able to have done that without the guidance and mentorship of other falconers. Now, one who was quite influential to me personally was my Uncle Gary, obviously. My mother's brother, his introduction to falconry was finding an injured black-shouldered kite in Africa, and he looked after it, managed to do some training. Obviously, once he had got the injured bird, he then looked into how to keep it, and that's where falconry came up. He didn't know there was a Zimbabwe Falconers Club for quite a while. He then had to join the Rhodesian Army because there was conscription. He then moved to South Africa, and when he was in South Africa, although falconry was illegal in South Africa, which is interesting because the only way you could be a falconer in South Africa was by, this is in the 70s and 80s, was by being an Air Force falconer. So it was illegal to do falconry in the country, but the Air Force employed this means of bird control, problem bird management, and the only way you could do it was by being an Air Force falconer. So anyway, my uncle went to South Africa, and he was working at a bird park, and he managed to keep a little red-breast sparrowhawk there. And then one day he arrived at the bird park and his bird's gone. Someone had stolen it. Years later, we were at a field meet and a story came out about a guy who heard a red-breast sparrowhawk calling and thought, well, this bird park isn't qualified enough to have the bird, I'm going to keep it. So he went and acquired that bird, and 20 years later my uncle and this gentleman managed to meet up and had some laughs over a beer over this bird. At the time, I'm sure they weren't going to be having laughs over beers. Anyway, he had to leave South Africa. He had done what he needed to do there, and he went back to Zimbabwe, joined the Zimbabwe Falconers Club, and then got involved in traditional club activities, going out on field meets, going out flying with the guys. In the 80s and the 90s, a very popular trend had developed in Zimbabwe where a number of prominent falconers started flying casts. You know, our African peregrine, it's called the Falco peregrinus minor. It's the smallest of all the subspecies of peregrine falcon. A male is about 450 to about 500 grams, somewhere there. So they're not very big. So how do you hunt quarry that is sizable? You basically go at it with a double barrel shotgun. So a lot of guys started flying our quarry with casts of teasels or casts of falcons. Ron Hartley particularly had a very good make hawk, so an adult female that he would use to teach the young female peregrines how to fly and develop their own style on the wing before moving on to other quarry. So flying casts was quite popular, and my uncle did quite a bit of that. And in the late 90s, it became quite economically viable for production companies like BBC, National Geographic to go out to Zimbabwe and do film work. So a lot of the eagle documentaries you might have seen from that era. One is called Life of Birds, another one Eagles, another one called The Hyrax. We did Rivers and Lakes of Africa, did another one Walking with Cavemen. So a lot of these documentaries required close-up establishing shots. And who do you talk to when you want to have a close-up of a raptor? Well, you talk to a falconer. Now, maybe not always a Verreaux's/black eagle or a martial eagle or a crowned eagle isn't such a common falconry bird, although we do train them and use them for falconry. Especially at that time, everyone was focused on your classic falconry species, your cipiters and your falcons. So what happened was members of the Zimbabwe Falconers Club got together and managed to train a whole bunch of these birds, and they used them for these documentaries, which then led into commercial falconry. My uncle then bought a bird park, and he still has that bird park despite all the economic troubles in Zimbabwe and the political situation. His bird park's still going, and he's been flying and hacking his Teersel peregrines in the same spot for 35 years now, so quite a long time. And he's having a great time at it. He's been hunting some of the same areas since before I was born. Made my access to falconry land quite easily. And it was I have a great memory of myself and him years down the line. I had left, gone on to other things, I needed to see different styles of falconry. That's one thing I wanted to learn. I believe everyone's got their style, and every style of falconry can have a positive impact on others. You might look at a pest controller and think, oh well, a pest controller isn't flying grouse in Scotland. But I'll tell you, something that pest controller learned flying over a warehouse will help one day in training a high-flying game hawk in Scotland. They all have crossovers. And we went back years later to the same field that we were flying on, and we were having a beer, and we looked over the sunset in Africa and thought, oh wow, this is special. This is a moment that you'll never forget, and I never will. And it was through the mentorship and the guidance and the learnership programs that I had been through because of our club structure that managed to allow me success in my style of falconry, as small as it is in the world. Now, my uncle didn't learn falconry himself. Of course, he had found an injured bird. Okay, he had rehabbed it and released it, and then he had got other birds and got into falconry. But when he wanted to fly casts, who did he learn from? Well, classic case of mentorship. He had a very well-known falconer called Arthur Dunkle, Dr. Arthur Dunkle. He was a surgeon, world-renowned for his skill in that as well, an artist as well. As with falconers, isn't it amazing how many diverse skills we develop? And Arthur Dunkle was no different. He had many, many different skills. And he was very, very influential in the initial research of finding where the tighter falcon nest sites were in Zimbabwe. Very passionate about the peregrines. He was involved in understanding how you can identify them. He went out on many, many whitewater rafting trips down the Bakota Gorge of Zimbabwe, just down from the Victoria Falls. It's about 60 kilometers stretch of this long gorge, and these tighter falcons, tiny little falcons, live there, very rare. And when they first found them, they found 3 pairs, and they were well shocked. They thought, this is incredible, we've got 3 pairs. Well, because of that foundation work, now there's estimated just in Zimbabwe to be between 50 and 70 tighter falcons. Obviously finding nests now with political situations is quite more challenging, but a big part of that was also understanding their behavior in a captive environment, and Arthur was quite influential in understanding that. He also found out through his study of incubation that they had a shorter incubation time. Instead of the average time at 28 to 31 days, it was actually 22 to 27 days in the tighter, obviously a much smaller falcon. He also found how you find them. How do you find a tiny little falcon in this huge gorge? And he took a few guys out with him, and one of the journeys they happened to pull up their little raft up against a sandbank on the edge of the gorge in the river, and they heard a high shrieking shrill. Any falconer will know the sound of a falcon calling when it's coming into its nest. And so this little bird did. They saw for a split second a tiny little dot go into the nest. They never saw it again. They decided to make camp, and you won't believe it, that evening, guess who's calling again? And that's how they found it. So they found out the best way to look for them was to actually listen for them, because you hear those calls. And how many people looking for precipitors in a forest use that same thing today? People will even play recordings and all of that. But in the 80s, nobody knew how to do that, especially in Africa. How do you go and look for a rare falcon that's only a handful of pairs known? And they managed to do it. And then through captive breeding programs, together with the Peregrine Fund as well, they were able to establish larger scale operations, together with another gentleman, Ron Hartley. Now, Ron Hartley was a school teacher, and he worked for the Peregrine Fund with a lot of their DDT research in Africa in the early days, but he expanded that to publishing over 100 papers, and there's still, I'm sure, cabinets full of his work that needs to be finished. But unfortunately, he's no longer with us, and it's a huge tragedy to the world. Ron Hartley worked a lot with the Peregrine Fund on peregrines, and I'll say the reason we fly peregrines in Zimbabwe is through his work, pioneering reintroduction programs, what was the DDT cases like, and then also captive breeding, because now we don't need to harvest passage peregrines, although we still have a wild take policy. And the reason why we don't need to harvest, especially for guys who aren't ready for a passage, we can get them captive bred birds now. And it's quite amazing the stuff that guys can do with captive bred birds that you wouldn't think 20 years ago you could achieve. Now, Ron was involved a lot with the school kids. He was a housemaster, not a headmaster, but he was a boarding school housemaster at a very well-known college called Falcon College, which is quite ironic because when he went to school, Falcon College was his rival as he went to Peterhouse School. Falcon was their rival, but then he went to Falcon and taught there for over 20 years and had an influence on numerous falconers. Him and Arthur managed to work out a way of breeding tighter falcons, breeding peregrines in abundance, that now people don't even need to worry about the population of peregrine falcons in southern Africa. A lot of his research was also done into the prey species. We all worry about our peregrines or our gyr falcons or the falcon we're flying or the hawk we're flying. Maybe it's a goshawk or a black spar. Maybe it's an African hawk eagle or a golden eagle. We all worry about this. But so few of us consider the quarry. We wouldn't be able to do falconry without the quarry. And this is where Ron really led the charge in southern Africa. With his students at school, every time a bird made a kill, there was a study done. What was the weight of the quarry? They would remove the crop, see what it's feeding on. Again, now okay, my quarry is eating this prey, definitely, because I've seen it in the crop. When I'm looking for that quarry, where should I go? Well, I should go out to areas that has that food source for the quarry. So he was very up in the front of that as well. And then also another thing that we all need to, in Southern Africa, be very thankful to Arthur and Ron for, was their development of a grading system and a structure in falconry which allows for mentorship and accountability and ethical practices. Now, a lot of the time, people don't consider those aspects of falconry when we just want to go out and fly our birds. The essence of falconry is we tend to be loners. We want to be out by ourselves in the field, in the sunset with our dog and our hawk. But when we need to think about the quarry, you need to then also consider you've got your dog, you've got your hawk, you've got your quarry, you've got falconry, but how do you preserve it? South Africa is a prime example. A law was put in place to prevent rooster fighting, cockfighting, chickens going at each other. And the law was briefly put, you can't set a bird on another bird. Now, it might have been for cockfighting with chickens, but in actual fact, it has a massive impact on falconry, because now you can't set your peregrine on the sandgrass, which in my opinion is the ultimate flight. Unfortunately, if you don't have a club to back you up and to have a voice for you as the lone falconer, very often the people who are trying to fight falconry what they will often do is have that support, have the club structure, and have the logistical background to push forward their narrative. Now, with a club structure that was developed by Arthur Dunkle, Ron Hartley, and a whole lot of other individuals, that allows us to lobby our cause. Now, the club structure often allows for you to be able to start without any experience and be guided along the way through your C grade, where you get your first bird, you make your first kill, you've got a muse that is sufficient, you've learned how to do the equipment. You'll get to your B grade, you now have more challenging birds like a black sparrowhawk or a lanner falcon. And I'm just summarizing this. And basically now you need to learn about fieldcraft. You need to learn about looking after a dog and training a hunting dog. Looking after your equipment, because now you can't ask your mentor to come and put anklets on or cope. And with all of this, those two individuals really, really helped. So hopefully that's given you an idea of how mentorships supported falconry, how each person that I've mentioned, Gary Stafford, Ron Hartley, Arthur Dunkle, have played an influential part in falconry. Now we'll go into a few little anecdotes about falconry. I was sitting with my uncle and Ron one day, and my uncle is quite religious, and I'm not saying Ron wasn't, but basically Ron believed that Archaeopteryx was the first bird and my uncle didn't because of his religion. And there was another gentleman, Peter Mundy, sitting there, and I was a kid. I must have been like 19 or 20, and I'm watching these big boys go at it and putting their scientific arguments, and I'm just a lowly little falconer. And I'm listening to these guys, and eventually it was funny how each one was rebating themselves, but they weren't actually disagreeing, although they were. It was so politically correct, it was quite funny. But in the end, Archaeopteryx won. I think Ron and his laugh at the end, that definitely drew a conclusion to that discussion. Arthur Dunkle's father had often gone out, dabbled in some falconry, and unfortunately he was getting on and he wasn't able to go out and practice falconry. And one of his last flights that he managed to witness, this is Arthur Dunkle's father, he went out with my uncle, and they were flying a peregrine teasel by the name of Rastus, and Rastus was flying, got good pitch. They managed to find a quarry, Swainson's Franklin. Dogs came on point, the setters then flushed on command. The Franklin came up perfectly over Gary, Arthur, and Arthur's father was the bind. Feathers falling over them like raindrops. It was incredible. And off Rastus went and landed in the distance, carried it quite a way. And unfortunately, a local herd boy had found Rastus before they had got to him. And he had stolen the pheasant, or the Swainson's Franklin, from Rastus. But the best part was Arthur's father got to see the bind directly over his head. It's moments like that that we all remember. We never remember the day we were cold and wet. We always remember the stoop that is embedded in our mind. And that was a great thing, is to go out. You've been going with Arthur, Gary and Arthur's father, you've been going out years together. But that one is the one that really, really counted. And without our influential falconers, like Ron Hartley, Arthur Dunkle, without people like that, you wouldn't get falconers in the world going even further, driving the sport. I mean, these were guys in small towns in Africa with no access to support. There was no internet in those days, yet they were achieving such a high standard of falconry because of their passion. And that passion shined through. With Ron, he wrote over 100 published articles on falconry or raptor biology. He was associated with the Peregrine Fund. He did work on DDT with crowned eagles, martial eagles, Varroes/black eagles, depending on which book you want to read. But basically, he was a falconer who knew that he had an impact for his passion. He didn't just want to go and fly a hawk and then forget about it. Arthur was the same. Arthur was passionate about tighter falcons and peregrines, had captive breeding programs for them, studied them. He was a scientist. He was down to the line. Everything had to be perfect and pre-planned for success. Now, what that takes us to is when we're just flying our bird out in the field, when you're sitting there and you might look at the quarry you've just caught, don't just look and say, oh, I caught a pheasant or a grouse or a sand grouse or a rabbit. Appreciate everything about it and share your memories. Write these things down. Document it. I am the worst person for anything theoretical. I don't want to write down anything.